想などない。脳により一瞬。
Wait, wasn't this supposed to be a cooking show? Fantasy has always been a staple of anime and of Japanese otaku culture in general. This isn't surprising considering the popularity of the genre with nerds the world over, but with the isekai genre finally beginning to show signs of running its course in Japanese media, creators have started returning to the root of isekai's success, the fantasy worlds they're set in. Over the past few years or so, we've also been blessed with a handful of anime that, at least in my eyes, have helped to revitalize the fantasy genre as its own standalone non-isekai genre. So let's dive into one of the three standing as one of those pillars and see how its music helped shape the foundations of its story and legacy. Dungeon Meshi, or Delicious in Dungeon, was a show that kind of flew under the radar for me, at least during the time it was airing. I'd heard some whispers that it was good and saw a few memes and comments here and there basically saying what I did in the intro, but aside from piquing my interest a bit, the show wasn't really moving up in the priority list for me. I was already planning on watching it eventually, given that it was a trigger show and generally seemed like a fun premise, but what really drove home its brilliance was when I heard the music for the first time. I could already surmise that the show was good given the general consensus online, but I couldn't have anticipated a fully fleshed out world and story that not only worked perfectly well standalone, but was being supplemented by a soundtrack from one of Japan's most legendary modern composers, Mitsuda Yasunori. Even as someone who hasn't fully played through most of the games he's contributed towards, hearing that he'll be part of a project is still exciting on its own. After all, it doesn't take a super fan of his to be familiar with the cultural impacts he's made with soundtracks like Chrono Triggers and multiple entries in the Xeno series, not to mention one of my personal favorites in Kid Icarus Uprising. In simpler terms, Dungeon Meshi already had a perfectly well-crafted world and story, and Mitsuda's music is what takes it to heights that we rarely ever see in other series. Given that, I was all in and ready to set out on an adventure with Laios, Senshi, Marcel, and Chilchak. The track playing now serves as an overture version of the show's main theme, introducing us to one of the most important and recurring musical motifs we'll hear throughout the soundtrack, as well as giving us a clear example of just how grand the music is going to be. The overture is a pretty classic staple of fantasy and sci-fi stories, as it sets the stage for the grandiose nature of what we are set to experience, and Dungeon Meshi's is one of the best examples I've heard in this era of anime. We start by opening with a series of quick rhythmic patterns, starting with the strings and tambourine, but quickly adding in brass and woodwinds alongside some other percussive elements, and most importantly for the intro section, the lute and a pair of crumb horns. Most people are probably already familiar with the lute, notably as the guitar-like instrument played by bards back in the Middle Ages, while the crumb horn is a far lesser-known woodwind instrument with a piercingly nasal tone not too dissimilar to a kazoo. Why these two instruments are so important to the piece is due to the time period from which they come from and what they represent in context to the setting of Dungeon Meshi. In an interview, Mitsuda said that his intention for these types of folk instruments from the European Middle Ages was to place us in the fantasy world of the story without specifically tying it to our world. By specifically writing the music in a way that the instruments wouldn't play as they would in our traditional real-world folk styles, he achieves this goal by creating a sound that is similar enough to connect us with the world and its characters while not necessarily feeling as though these elements are being based off of any real-world locations. Dungeon Meshi's world is sort of medieval European in style, but it obviously isn't any version of Europe that we're familiar with. Getting back to the music itself, we're immediately placed in a D-Dorian key, outlined by the low strings, which fits with the European-esque folk inspiration as Dorian is the Western folk mode. These low staccato strikes on D not only serve to give us the sense of the key, but to continue building tension as the rest of the instruments come in. Music is structured around building and releasing tension, almost always doing so by means of chord progressions, and one of the easiest ways to build tension is to hold off on resolving a chord to its tonic. While we are starting and holding these first 16 bars on the tonic of D, this in itself makes the music feel unresolved, as there are obvious swells in the intensity of the music with the lute, crumb horns, and other orchestral sections building upon one another. The lead crumhorn plays arguably the most important leitmotif of the entire series, as this is the actual theme of Dungeon Meshi that we'll hear throughout multiple tracks in the show, rewritten and reharmonized to fit into various contexts. Disregarding some of the ornamentations a bit, the basic melody looks something like this, a call and response rising up to the 7th before circling back around to the tonic. Like any good leitmotif, this simple rising and falling action makes the melody itself highly malleable for use in scenes that aren't nearly as grand as this one, while still calling our attention to the theme as a recurring piece of music. Once the opening section bursts beyond its repeating D chord, we finally see some motion with a D minor, F, C, G, a 1-3-7-4. This is followed by a response of D minor, F, G, B flat, a 1-3-4 flat 6. This chord progression then repeats the first half again before closing out on another sustained D as we transition into a slower section. For the most part, there isn't anything particularly interesting about these chord progressions, as they're fairly straightforward for the style of music we're in, and even easier to see as standard Japanese chord progressions if we look at them in the context of the relative C major key. What really stands out here is the level of smart orchestration and the way in which Mitsuda has the melodic lines weaving in and out of each other, working together like a finely crafted party to bring down their foes. As one line goes up, others go down, with support for both happening in different octaves in different sections of the orchestra. Instrument sections weave in and out of the forefront so that it's hard to say that any one of them has the spotlight, instead forming a cohesive whole that epitomizes the sense of teamwork and adventure. The slow section drops most of the orchestra all at once, focusing in on the harp and voice as the rhythmic feeling shifts to halftime from the previous part. This change in atmosphere is also reflected in the key change to D minor and the more complex chord progressions, going from D sus over B flat, F sharp minor 7, G minor 7 to D minor. Not only does this F-sharp chord make for a strange diminished fourth jump down from the B-flat, briefly borrowing notes from the parallel D major, but the first chord itself is also technically the same as the third, as both could be read as different inversions of a G minor 7. This helps to create a deeply fantasy-entrenched atmosphere, sequencing unusual chords back-to-back in a slightly odd yet still coherent manner. The use of the voice and harp gives off mermaid vibes, while the reflected G minor 7 variations can be seen as distorted reflections within the water, not unlike the many water-related monsters the parties come across within the dungeon. And on a more simple sonic level, this dramatic slowdown ties the listener to the drama of the story, focusing in on Fallen and the deep ties she has to Laios, Marcel, and Shiro in particular. The slow section's second half ends on a much more hopeful feeling, progressing through E flat, B minor 7, B flat major 7, and A7. Despite the rising sense of hope the music seems to express, it's interesting to note that the bass line continues to descend, a representation of the direction Laios and the others must travel in to rescue Fallen. While the descent leads them further from safety, it also brings them closer to their goal, and thus the music reflects this in its optimism. The following sections go through the same sort of motions that the first two did, but with differences to reflect the changing nature of the first season's evolving storyline. Where the intro section introduced folk elements and led into an explosive orchestral section that followed, these next two sections do so in a more purposeful manner. Led by a tambourine rhythm, our folk instruments for this next section are our fiddle and recorders, playing much more dramatically than the opening lute and crumhorns did. This is meant to show the change in the character's motivations in the events that follow Fallen's revival. We already know how grand the story is, and we need something more emotional to keep us connected to the characters and their determinations. The following orchestral section brings back the series' main leitmotif, but the main changes occur in the melodies that come after, having the strings interplay with the wind sections to form an even stronger sense of unity and stability. We aren't simply watching a group of random fantasy world adventurers we know nothing about anymore. We're actively cheering on the team that we've come to see overcome multiple hardships by working together. Following a big blast that all the instruments play in unison, the piece closes out on a slower section led by the lute. This final series of chords plays out as D5, A minor, F major 7, G6, A sus, with the final A sus giving us a classic open sound to indicate that, while the story is yet unfinished, there is hope for the future of our adventurers and their quest for both Fallen and food. Arguably, this is the second most important theme of the series, as it covers the aspects of the show that aren't adventure-related, cooking and food. As much as we've joked about and seen just how incredible the story, characters, and world are, ultimately it's still a show about food, and each episode is always sure to show at least one new dish, even if it sometimes feels tacked on for the sake of theming.
黒魔術で作られた都と魔物の全てが手の内に入った時、この男はどうする？素直にこの迷宮を封じるだろうか。
腹減ってないか？
え？
After having listened to the main theme and its variants, it becomes immediately apparent just how unserious this track is by comparison, which is of course intentional. Since the main theme more or less covers all of the more action-oriented and dramatic elements of the series, the food theme only needs to convey the much more lighthearted feelings associated with their meals. Right from the get-go, we already know that the large majority of these food scenes aren't meant to be taken too seriously, as characters like Marcel express their disgust at the idea of eating monsters, while Laios and Senshi are comically placed on the other end of the spectrum. These feelings do shift throughout the show, but there is usually some kind of context as to why they may feel more or less comfortable eating what's in front of them, and there are multiple variants of the theme to reflect this. In an old video of mine, I talked about the techniques composers utilize to make music sound whimsical, and this track basically follows all of them to a T. This can be heard in the first few measures, opening with some plucked strings and staccato string clusters that are then followed by a high recorder playing chromatic lines with quick runs and some non-standard intervals. This is then repeated with a second recorder playing an octave down and changing the last two notes for a call and response type of sound. Where the music really takes off is from bar 22, where we get the first instance of the theme's main motif. Harmonically, it's extremely simple, the first 4 bars going D, D, G minor, D, followed by the next 4 responding with a slightly altered D, D, G minor, D, the same progressions back to back. While these are simple chords to explain, the actual sound of them is much more playful, toying with the idea of these delicious meals being made with arguably unappetizing ingredients. The added C in the G minor chord acts like a slight lurch in the stomach at the sight of the food, though not anything intense enough to cause anything. The E sharp in the D chord then clashes with the major third's F sharp to illustrate the mixed emotions over the food's taste and where it came from, stacking both the major and minor thirds right on top of one another. This repeats once more, adding in a flighty string counter melody to ramp up the mischief through some chromaticism. This doesn't add much in terms of material, but it does give the texture just enough of an expansion to allow the strings to take the lead as we move into a more mellow legato section. Here we briefly shift away from the dissonant, whimsical sounds we've been utilizing as the strings play in a pleasant and flowing melody, going G, A sharp, B minor, C, a simple rising motion easily seen and heard in the bass line. This is then followed up by G, A, B sus, B, walking us back down by utilizing various chord inversions. This simple moment of bliss shows how the characters can relax and enjoy the food once they know it's both safe to eat and delicious. Of course, this music tends to play over the cooking sequences as opposed to the actual dining scenes, but it's simple enough to substitute the sensation of taste for smell, and it works all the same in every iteration. Between the main theme and the cooking theme, Dungeon Meshi's soundtrack is already quite filled out, though the rest of the music is no less impressive than either of these two tracks. Nowadays, it's rare to come across regular TV series, anime, or or otherwise that can so effectively utilize musical themes and leitmotifs in ways that we don't often hear aside from legendary film composers like John Williams or Hisaishi Joe. Granted, Mitsuda Yasunori and his team could arguably be considered the video game equivalent of such legends, so it really shouldn't come as a surprise that the music for Dungeon Meshi turned out the way it did. And while he's certainly no stranger to the world of anime soundtracks either, with anime's ever-growing popularity and increased output, I can only hope that he'll continue to bring these animated worlds to life with his rich and inspiring music. Dungeon Meshi is one of the best new fantasy shows to have cropped up in the past few years, and a huge part of what makes it so memorable is its incredible music. Mitsuda really cooked hard when he got to work on this soundtrack, and I'd argue that of the 3 fantasy shows that have helped to revitalize the non-isekai fantasy genre for anime, this one is probably the most innovative with its soundtrack. That being said, it certainly isn't revitalizing the genre all on its own, so if you'd like to see and hear what else I think has been putting in the work for fantasy nerds like myself, then make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. There's also an extended cut of this analysis that includes a whole separate piece of music that I just couldn't include in this YouTube version of the video, so if you'd like to see that and get access to all of the transcriptions I've done for this video and all the videos I've done across my channel, then make sure to go and support me over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.